first things first, caveat, please be cautious when you're talking about context of someone's life. It's very simplistic to say, well, because Jane Austen was once proposed to by this man, she therefore did not like marriage, which is clearly nonsense. Yeah, so be really cautious of just writing something the examiner's going to go, that's nonsense. So that is really important. I also think context is central to our understanding of these texts. Not to say that we can say, oh, because Ishiguro was born in Japan, he clearly was an anti blah, blah, blah. I don't think we can say that, but I think, of course, it's important to understand what the writer is doing, the time they were writing. We cannot study Mary Shelley and think that it was written in 2020. We've got to understand it in the 19th century, which is why it's really hard to read. Ishiguro was born in 1955, Nagasaki, Japan. The reason you may have heard of Nagasaki is it's known as being one of the places that was bombed by the nuclear bombs as part of the Second World War. The atomic bombs killed between 39,000 and 80,000 people initially, but the after effects of the atomic bomb were felt for generations because of radiation poisoning. You'll have all these notes and you can watch this back. So it's interesting that that's the context he came from, that a context where for generations they have been having the after effects of nuclear radiation poisoning, which causes birth defects and many other issues. I would still be cautious about this because, of course, Ishiguro moved to England when he was 5. So I would always be the most cautious about using any personal context for a writer. It's something that I see quite a lot in essays, and I would want to avoid is Mary Shelley once had sex in a graveyard, and therefore this means that she was obsessed with graveyards. We don't know. We don't. I think it's conjecture. So I would be cautious with sweeping statements. We've got to be cautious with the past, and with culture. Our culture, don't apply it to cultures of the past. So be very cautious of that. Good. Let's carry on then with dystopia. Dystopia is an imagined society where there's great suffering or injustice. They're often totalitarian or apocalyptic. So this has dystopian elements. It's not as simple as 1984, which is one of the texts that's fabulous for coursework. But there's definitely an imagined society, and there is great suffering and there is injustice, but it's not as simplistic as many dystopian fictions, like The Handmaid's Tale, which is one of the others in this cluster. The other options that students around the country are studying is War of the Worlds, Handmaid's Tale, and so they will be doing those. So your questions must always fit all of those books. Gothic, you've got to understand Gothic, and one of the things you must address either now or over the summer is watching the e-magazine clips from David Punter. I gave you instructions for how to log into that. Terror is the feeling of dread, a feeling of dread or anxiety or a feeling in one of discomfort. It's the feeling. Horror is physical, and it's a simple way of remembering. Terror, feeling, horror, physical. And these are pretty blunt instruments to use. They are more nuanced than this, but that's a simplish way of understanding them. Terror is a feeling of dread. Horror is a physical shock and revulsion. I would argue that Never Let Me Go starts in terror and builds to horror as we go through. I think that's a really interesting way to consider the AO2, the way the writer crafts the text. But it starts with this slight feeling of dread at the beginning. What we're going to talk about in a moment of uncanny, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, so don't worry about uncanny now. But this sense of the uncanny, something very other, a little bit alien from us, it's alienation. And then actually, as the novel carries on, we feel more and more a sense of physical shock and revulsion. And if we don't feel it, sometimes we may realize it afterwards. You must understand Gothic. It's really, really important. Hope and hopelessness, I think, is a key idea in the novel. And I'm going to just highlight this to link to that. Ishiguro said, this is a rather cheerful tale. This book really stresses the positive side of human nature. Humans are capable of caring deeply for one another. And there's a really interesting query that we ask. Is this a cheerful tale, as Ishiguro said in multiple interviews? It does stress the positive side of human nature. It also, we could argue, is a hopeless tale about the plight of all humans. And you could say the same for Frankenstein. The lack of responsibility that we take for our own creation, whether that's our children or the world. Unlock the tabula rasa, whether humans take responsibility for their actions or not. The plight of all humans. Is the plight of all humans hopeless or hopeful? Very interesting. Both novels are asking that same question. Compare the ways two writers you have studied. I always think of the question. Compare the ways two writers you have studied. Look at the theme of hope. That'd be an amazing question, wouldn't it? Both writers suggest that hope is possible. Hope isn't possible. Hope is possible if we take responsibility for our creation. Really interesting. That'd be an amazing question. So we're always thinking comparison and the ways we will consider it, not just one way. I don't want you to list hope. There's hope in this, there's hope in this, there's hope in this, there's hope in this. I want you to say the ways they use hope. They use hope by, they use hope by. Okay, multiplicity of readings, don't be simplistic, and we're always thinking about the comparison. Eugenics. If you didn't know the word, eugenics is the belief in improving mankind by removing difficulties in the gene pool. Eugenics is negative. Essentially, eugenics is using it to actually remove parts of the human race because we don't like that trait, rather than on medical grounds for the correctness of the sustaining of life, or because that life was not possible. The Nazis, for example, were eugenicists. They sought to eradicate traits in humanity they disliked. I'm being very cautious with my language. IVF in itself is essentially using a sperm and an egg that would happen naturally. Some people have likened IVF, which is where, for example, if a couple cannot have a child, they will fuse the sperm and ovum in medical conditions and then reinsert them into the female womb. Some in the past have likened this to eugenics, but that is only the case if you, for example, check that it is a male gender and then you reinsert it. So you've got very, very difficult moral grey areas of whether countries do use this to select by, let's say, gender scenario, whereas you've got difficulties of, does that therefore mean in some cultures they select by natural traits? Very interesting. So you've got normal versions of selecting, and then you've got taking that as far as eugenics, whether you therefore remove anyone who's not blonde haired, which is what the Nazis sought to do, or anyone who was a homosexual, or anyone who's Jewish. You've also got a query about institutions to put people in. I mean, you know this from Streetcar Named Desire. In history, you would use orphanages. You wouldn't have foster homes. So you would place children into an institution, workhouses, literally a place that would house people. And you, for example, in orphanages, those children would be massed together and they wouldn't have a parent. Now we know, modern psychology teaches us that we need, in order to form identity, we need a parental figure in attachment. Key to forming good social skills is to form an attachment. Now, Ishiguro is writing this in 2005. So attachment has been theorized. We've known about attachment, but actually without attachment, you have attachment disorders. When we look at the psychological principle of attachment, when we're reading this novel, we can see this and we can use it then on the 19th century text of Frankenstein. We can look back and consider the danger of no attachment in our reading of Frankenstein. Of course, we recognize that Shelley knew nothing of attachment. We are modern readers applying that to the text. We cannot say Mary Shelley clearly references attachment theories in Frankenstein. That's utter nonsense. So we've got to think of modern readers applying that to the text. But I think it's very interesting to look at institutionalized peoples and what institutions do, both for the creature and for these students. Having said that, Ishiguro said it's a rather cheerful tale and it's about the positive side of human nature, James Wood, in The Fun Stuff, which is published by Random House in 2013, said, and you will have this quotation later, the cloned children are educated at school for lives of perfect pointlessness. Pointless because they will die before they can grasp adulthood. They are dipped in fragility. They possess individuality and seem to enjoy it. They fall in love, they have sex, they read George Eliot. So they read great literature. But that individuality is a mirage, a parody, a mockery of liberty. So that's really interesting. Is this a positive tale, or is it a tale of deep sadness? And that's, I think, a very interesting one we could argue both sides of. Something I'm going to be very cautious with, but it is a context we need to acknowledge. Cautious because Kathy passively accepts her slavery, and she even continues to support it by becoming a carer. So we've got a sense of whether this is speaking into a culture of enslavement. Now, I mean that in the broader sense of the term, that we will all leave college, go to work, get a job, feed into the tax system, working for money that we can't take with us when we die, for a system that is essentially making us earn money that we won't ever use. So I think to a certain extent, we are all in this system of consumerism. Buy stuff, because if you have stuff, you are valid. The more stuff, the more money you have, the more valid you are. This is the enslavement we are all in. And then I do also mean an exploration of the transatlantic slave trade that encouraged slaves to enslave one another. So I think this is very interesting, but something I would be exceptionally cautious and tentative in my tone. The context of us passively accepting our fate. And you still, for example, have vast swathes of the world where you do have people still enslaved. Another context I think is really thought-provoking is there was a girl in Hiroshima, which is another place in Japan that was bombed by an atomic bomb. She was 2 when Hiroshima was bombed. She was severely irradiated, but she lived for 10 years. She was known as a bomb-affected person. She became widely known, and there are statues about her now. She had leukemia, but she is said to have folded during her time at home 1,000 origami cranes. Okay, so she is said to have folded 1,000 paper birds. And the idea that even if you are damaged, you still seek creativity. Trapped, captured, but creative is a very interesting one. Why don't they leave? And I think this is what strikes me, is that the creature tries to reject his fate. He tries to reject his position. I, like the arch fiend, or hell within me, like Lucifer. And he gives himself over to evil. Of course, at the end, he goes off into the ice alone. There's a very different. Tommy and Kathy accept their fate, but it's no different. So is it that unless society changes, we will all have to give in to our fate? I think that is a big comment in both novels. Unless we change society, the outcomes will always be the same. Of course, Shelley's is a much more Gothic text and is not meant to be a realist fiction. It's meant to be escapism. But I definitely think there's definitely a comment on how we treat the outsider, how we treat the person who looks different, how we treat the deformed. And you've got very interesting comments. For example, modern critics have looked at Frankenstein as a kind of post-colonial readings of Frankenstein as the creature as kind of other race. So very interesting how we treat the outsider, the deformed, the different, the clone. And there's also queries of how we use science. Unless we use a balance of science and morality, that need for morals and judgment. So we need that, very cautious. And both these novels also speak into that actually the advancement for one, I would like, for example, and we learned at Never Let Me Go that the reason why they've developed clones is so you can cure cancer, motor neuron disease, absolutely devastating illnesses. But I also think that at the end of Never Let Me Go, I think what we may all realize is we are all, like Tommy, raging against what we're taught, but we all give in, like Tommy. So Tommy and the Creature strike me. 153, I'll just leave that up for a moment. We realized he used to rage in infants. We learned, by the way, that they were infants. They were in an institution when they were infants. So at the beginning, when we're still in the terror phase, we realized they were institutionalized when they were infants. 268, Miss Lucy was right. He tries to rail against his circumstances. And Kathy says that he used to be angry because at some level you always knew. And then he says, maybe I did know. Something the rest of you didn't. Tommy rages. 153 to the Tommy who'd had to be barricaded inside a classroom while he kicked over the desks. That reminds me of the Creature in chapter 12 and onwards, when he starts giving himself over to anger. He realizes that the deferrals that they have held on to as a beacon of hope, that they can't defer. There's no such thing. And I've put a cross-reference with page 268 and 9, 268 and 268 and 269. Let's go there next. So that's page 153. Then let's go to page 268 and 9, when they've found out that there are no deferrals, when I heard the first scream. At first, I didn't think it was him, but some maniac who'd been lurking in the bushes. I was already out of the car when the second and third screams came, and by then I knew it was Tommy, though that hardly lessened my urgency. In fact, for a moment, I was probably close to panic. And then it goes on, page 269. Tommy's figure, raging, shouting, flinging his fists and kicking out. I tried to run to him, but the mud stuck my feet down. His jumbled swear words continued uninterrupted as I was unable to reach him. He was going to his feet again. Mud distorted with fury reached for his arms, flailing arms, and held on tight. He tried to shake me off, and this links to page 11 when he hits her accidentally in one of his rages. And they hug, hold each other, raging against the state, their position. Let's look at page 270. I was thinking, I said, about back then at Hailsham when you used to go bonkers like that, and we couldn't understand it. We couldn't understand how you could ever get like that. And I was just having this idea, just a thought really. I was thinking that maybe the reason you used to get like that was because at some level you always knew. Don't think so, Kath. No. It was always just me being an idiot. That was all it ever was. So again, his value, lack of valuing of himself. That's a funny idea. Maybe I did know somewhere deep down something the rest of you didn't. And it's interesting that the creature and Tommy, for me, provide really interesting connections. Really think about the connections, the creature and Tommy. And if we move to chapter 16 of Frankenstein, so it's either volume 2, chapter 8 or chapter 16. This is where the monster rages, William's murder is explained, and the monster demands a mate. The creature demands a mate. Either monster or creature, whichever you prefer. Cursed creator, why did I live? Why in that instant did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly, so unthinkingly bestowed? I know not, despair had not yet taken possession of me. He doesn't yet feel despairing. Page 270 of Never. My feelings were those of rage and revenge. He's still angry and wants revenge. He doesn't yet feel hopeless. I could, with pleasure, have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants. I've glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. He could have, but he doesn't. And look at this anguish, fearful howlings. My goodness, this is similar to page 268, 69, isn't it? Incredibly similar to Tommy. It's like a wild beast that had broken the toils. Page 11 of where he is angry, shouting, flailing about, and all the students watch him. He's Satan rather than Adam here. Anguish, fearful howling sounds like a wild beast that had broken the toils, destroying the objects that obstructed me, with ranging through the wood with stag-like swiftness. Oh, what a miserable night I passed. And then, of course, I, like the arch-fiend, bore a hell within me, wished to tear up the trees. It's amazing. It's extraordinarily similar to Tommy, isn't it? Raging. It's brilliant. I absolutely, I love the comparison. And you can see through these chapters, you can see he hopes that humanity will be unprejudiced. So it's, for me, it's on page 144. It starts with a paragraph. At this time, a slight sleep relieved me from the pain of reflection. He sees William. He sees William. And he thinks that because he's a child, he will be unprejudiced. And this is key. He thinks that he will be unprejudiced. It's in the other edition on page 109, about just over halfway down. At this time, a slight sleep. So he comes across a beautiful child, a human child. When they're in Norfolk and they look in at the window of the workplace, the idea that Ruth could go and work there, they could come and visit her. Hope. Ruth. He came running into the recess I'd chosen with all the sportiveness of infancy. Suddenly, as I gazed on him, an idea seized me that this little creature was unprejudiced, as if children were unprejudiced. And this reminds me again of chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Never. As if the children at Hailsham were unprejudiced, which is so far from the case, as these little outgroups bully one another. Bullying. He had lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. He's too young to be put off by deformity. If, therefore, I should seize him and educate him as my companion and friend, I should not be so desolate. He assumes that children will be innocent, like he was innocent. And of course, William struggles. Let me go, he cried. Monster, ugly wretch, you wish to eat me and tear me to pieces. You are an ogre. Let me go, or I will tell my papa. Boy, you'll never see your father again. You must come with me. Hideous monster, let me go. My papa is a syndic. He is Monsieur Frankenstein. He will punish you. You dare not keep me. Frankenstein? You belong then to my enemy, to him towards whom I have sworn eternal revenge. You shall be my first victim. And he grasps his throat to silence him. And of course, in that moment, victim, his heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. They have created him as such an other. They have made him so other that he now becomes killer. It's really interesting that actually by treating him as less than human, he indeed becomes less than human. Just as the characters in Never Let Me Go are treated as less than human, and then they become less than human. He immediately afterwards looks at an image of a lovely young woman. And he says, in spite of my malignity, it softened and attracted me. For a few moments, I gazed with delight on her dark eyes, fringed by deep lashes, her lovely lips, but presently my rage returned. He remembers he is deprived from this. He can never enter into natural heterosexual relationships. He is excluded from this world, just as the students are excluded when they watch the TV at copying of couples on the television. They cannot form natural connection. We've got that psychological principle of attachment. They don't know how to make natural relationships. And he then comes across Justine sleeping on the straw. Now, this all happens with incredible pace. He sees Justine on the floor, sleeping in the hay. She's blooming in the loveliness of youth and health. And he bends over her and whispers, awake, fairest, the lover is near. He who would give his life but to obtain one look of affection from thine. His speech is romantic, is beautiful, which, of course, both Tommy and Kathy don't have that capacity. It's not romantic. There's very little romance. There seems very little ability to form depth of connection. I could argue against that, by the way, because we could argue they have that connection throughout. But what's interesting is then she wakes, or she stirs, and so he decides to put the picture on her. He realizes he's absolutely excluded from this life. And that's what's interesting is then he says, I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me, but one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. That's why the clones are forced together, not accepted by society, not accepted by humanity. What's this? Kingsfield, Hailsham, where else are there? You know, all the places that are mentioned. Hailsham is a nice one. Kingsfield is the place where she ends up with Tommy, where, what's it, the outdoor space they have is filled with thistles, and it's huge contrast with Hailsham with its ponds and beautiful imagery. When she's with Tommy at Kingsfield, it's absolutely deeply unpleasant. This is where the clones are left. And then, for example, on page 260, I've said this before, but it links us to You'd not sleep for days. This is page 260. You'd not sleep for days if you saw what goes on in some of those places. Factories for clones, vast government homes. Glenn Morgan's another good one. So the fact that the creature realizes the only being that will accept him is someone like him. So Dolly the sheep. So we've also clearly got cloning, obviously. Cloning of Dolly's sheep. She was cloned in 1996, the only sheep born of 277 attempts. So, for example, they knew that she was cloned because, of course, she was then implanted into a black-faced sheep. And since then, people have at various points claimed to have cloned humans, for example, other things. You've also got, for example, lots of things about robotics. For example, there's robotics. There's a female robot that can simulate, that blinks, breathes, and can have a conversation that was done in the early 2000s. So pre-Never Let Me Go, with the first robotics that were able to respond to human interaction by blinking, breathing, and having a conversation which you have with them. So there's clearly cloning, which was before the book and is obviously referenced in this. And you've also got, for example, robotics, which again in the early 2000s was already going forward with great pace. So we've got that. Something I think is really interesting is Theresienstadt. So it's quite high level context, but it really informs my reading of the novel when I come back to this multiple times. And I think this is very, very interesting to consider. Now, a ghetto, literally an excluded place. I'm sure you know this, but I'm going to run through this in case you didn't do history at GCSE. All the way through the Second World War, the Nazis removed people they did not approve of, did not fit their ideology, their kind of system of ideas. They removed Jews and political dissidents and, for example, homosexuals to ghettos, to kind of space which were distinct from the rest of society. Now, in Czechoslovakia, as it says, this bit at the bottom, in Czechoslovakia, in a place called Terezin, so there's a town, was Terezin in Czech, or Theresienstadt. There was a camp which Jews were sent to as a stopping point before they were sent on to places like Auschwitz-Birkenau and death camps, where they were. Theresienstadt was a ghetto and was a transit camp, a temporary holding place for Jews on their ways to camps further east. It's really interesting context because the International Red Cross came. There was limited access to knowledge, but also there was a lot of not really wanting to examine what was going on in Nazi Germany, a mix of not knowing and also avoidance of knowing. The International Red Cross then went to Theresienstadt for an investigation, and they were shown children who were happy and healthy. It was a camp that had Jewish leaders as the elders who organized it, had a kind of governance, religious. They were allowed religious ceremonies, both Jewish, Christian, and there were also atheists in the camp, so it wasn't forbidden to be Jewish, whereas in most camps it was absolutely forbidden to follow anything other than the Nazi version of a belief. And lots of people were incarcerated there. What's interesting is the International Red Cross in 1944 went there and came away believing that there were opportunities for play. This was a pleasant place that they went. It's extraordinarily late, by the way, isn't it? 1944. And there was a propaganda film made about the camp. And the film was The Führer Gives the Jews a City. And it was used with dialogue. For example, all the children of Theresienstadt find opportunities for play. You got institutionalized, you got organized by people within the system. You've got a front that, similarly to Helsham, seems hopeful, seems positive, and yet is still troubling. A transit camp on the way to other death camps. Also, the children at Theresienstadt made art about their lives there. They made art about their lives there. There was art, there was poetry, they had concerts, they had poetry readings, they had a rich cultural life at Theresienstadt. And so this, very similarly to Hailsham, raises a query of freedom and a lack of freedom. We've got huge complexity here, but I do think it adds something again. We always have to be subtle with this. We have to be careful with our use of this. We can't say Hailsham is clearly referencing Theresienstadt. I think we could say the way that Ishiguro writes about Hailsham may be reminiscent of ghetto camps such as, let's write that down. The way Ishiguro creates a veneer of what? Hope and freedom at Hailsham may reference the experience of children held at as Kathy admits we were told and not told. Things to note: cautious tone. You've got to be cautious with your tone. Don't be too forthright. As you can ask Kishiguro, got to be cautious. The second link, we always link it to quotations. Context without quotations is just you telling me about the story. Okay, so a couple of things. We always have cautious tone, and that's something I would definitely want to develop if you want to look for a B or an A, up to an A star, obviously, which is what everyone should be aiming. And then I think we also need to make sure we always link to quotations. We were told and not told. That sense that they have freedoms, they can create art, but this is always limited, of course, because actually, let's add to another quotation to prove you had souls at all. Okay, so chapter 22 is a really, really important chapter. It is possibly the most important chapter in the novel. We took away your art because we thought it would reveal your souls, or to put it more finely, we did it to prove you had souls at all. And that for me makes a very interesting point about those children in Theresienstadt, that creation of art, but actually proving that these children had souls. So, but I have to tell you, my dear, it wasn't something commonly held when we first set out in all those years ago. So these people don't even have souls. And this brings us back into eugenics. This brings us back into cloning, etc. Perhaps Hailsham does go against the machine and trying to prove they do have souls and giving them hope. Or is it actually just sustaining them in their hopelessness rather than accepting from the beginning? So again, next one, robotics, which I mentioned. In the 1970s, robotics professor Masahiro Mori wrote The Uncanny Valley in Robotics and Automation magazine about how he thought people might react to robots, which of course is brilliant. 1970s was when the beginning of robotics started, so very interesting. He hypothesized that if they looked human, the human's response would move swiftly from empathy to revulsion. We're quite happy to use robotics if they look like robots, but if they look like humans, we move very swiftly from feeling for them, empathy, to revulsion. I think it's a very interesting idea. If they look too similar to us, we feel uncanny. I love this phrase, and I think throughout this, and particularly in the early chapters, we feel a sense of the uncanny. This is, for me, in the early chapters, something we feel definitely uncanny, and I'm going to draw out quite a lot of this in chapter 1 when we do it in the next session. If we feel an affinity to them, if they feel too close to us, we feel uncanny. Now, uncanny is to feel strangely familiar. Ernst Jentsch and Sigmund Freud elaborated on this idea. So Ernst Jentsch came up with the idea, and then Freud elaborated on this. It was unheimlich in German. Unheimlich. Uncanny. Unhomely, if you look at the direct translation. Unheimlich means unhomely, not at home, ill at ease. Unheimlich, not at home, ill at ease. So the idea, we do not feel at home with the ideas. Not quite right. That sense of it being not quite right, that is key to when we read the novel. Frankenstein is much more Gothic. From the beginning, it's not trying to be similar, is it? We've got northern climates, vast landscapes. We've got foreign travel, which for the 19th century was incredibly unusual. It's not close to a reader of the 19th century. Frankenstein is not uncanny because it's not similar to the experience of the reader. Gothic, shocking, political, far from it's not normal, it's not realist, not at all. Shocking, travel, extraordinary events, hauntings, death, sex, etc. Incest, all of that. It's not uncanny because it's not like us. We don't read Frankenstein and think that that could happen to us. But we do read this and we wonder, why is it they value art so much over sport? They are so like us and yet so not. And we feel uncanny. It's much more terror. It's not Gothic horror. Frankenstein is very quickly Gothic horror. Charnel houses, dead bodies, cell, my den of workshop, filthy creation, my cell at the top of the house, etc. It's incredibly Gothic, whereas we've got an uncanny sense of dystopia, something not quite right. And Masahiro Mori's article in 1970s, later than Freud, came up with this idea, uncanny valley. So this is how familiar they are. So if they're very familiar, and they move, they're a healthy person. We feel fine about them. We have an industrial robot. They look nothing like humans. So humans over here, healthy person, and we move about. And then we have a humanoid robot. They become very familiar to us, and we're okay with that. And then suddenly they become unfamiliar and terrifying. He thought this was the uncanny valley, where we move from accepting to hating. That's chapter 22, because everyone was happy with Hailsham until the Morningdale scandal. Page 256, shadowy objects in test tubes. And then they tried to argue that they were children. Very vocal movement. We challenged the entire way the donations program was being run. More importantly, we demonstrated in the world that if students were reared in a humane, cultivated environment, it was possible for them to grow as sensitive and intelligent as any ordinary human being. Before that, all clones, or students as we prefer to call them, existed only to supply medical science. In those early days after the war, Second World War, clearly in that moment, a reference to post-Second World War. That's largely all you were to most people, shadowy test tubes. You've got IVF. And then, for example, look at this art. How dare you claim these children are anything less than human, Terence Ianstadt. Oh, yes, there was a lot of support for our movement back then. The tide was with us. But then, of course, the Morningdale business came along. You can look at this later when the great breakthroughs in science followed one after another, reared, whether you'd brought into existence. There was no way to reverse the process. So we've got this is key. Look at this later. What was the Morningdale scandal you keep mentioning, Miss Emily? James Morningdale, a scientist, quite talented. He carried on his work in a remote part of Scotland, Frankenstein, where I suppose he thought he'd attract less attention. Frankenstein. What he wanted to offer was the possibility of having children with enhanced characteristics. And this is the uncanny valley. We're quite happy if they aren't too similar to us. Superior intelligence, superior athleticism, the creature, that sort of thing. The creature is incredibly athletic. He moves more swiftly than humans. He's stronger than humans. He's clearly cleverer than humans. Of course, there'd been other with similar ambitions, but this Morningdale fellow, he'd taken his research much farther. Eugenics, then anyone before him, far beyond legal boundaries. Well, he was discovered, they put an end to his work, and that seemed to be that. Except, of course, it wasn't, not for us. Children, demonstrably superior to the rest of us? Oh no, that frightened people. They recoiled from that. After all, it wasn't just Morningdale, there were other things at that time, television series. The world didn't want to be reminded how the donation program really worked. They wanted you back in the shadows. Terence Ianstadt, the treatment of Jews. You've also got oblique, be careful with this, references to, for example, enslavement of peoples. You've also got, for example, robotics, where the robots can indeed have intelligence. Got lots of very complex things. So we have covered a huge amount.